So tonight I'm going to talk about architecture and the city and the role of the arts in our practice. We've been focusing on the arts since our earliest projects. And I think for us that what that means is this very inextricable way in which buildings and cities are linked. And so across scales of work, from very small interiors to larger standalone buildings, I think it's that interconnectedness that defines all of our work. And so tonight I'll start with a little bit of an autobiographical frame of how we started as a kind of platform for presenting kind of three bodies of work, a series of collaborative projects, including CAB, the way in which we work on curatorial projects and collaborate with large groups of architects. And then I'll talk about a collection of campus buildings, a certain kind of urbanism, and then I'll end with a number of museums. So our very first works were in Marfa, Texas. We started in Texas, so it's always good to come back. And they were for a foundation called Lannan Foundation initially, and they were really very modest kind of renovations, turning domestic spaces into semi-institutional environments, artist studios, some small houses. And I think what was really important about this work, and I say this to the students in particular, is that what was really important about this time in Marfa, such an incredible collection of creative people, was the foundations, the community that we built. Many of the folks that we worked with have become, really important artists or museum curators, and so building a community started in Marfa. We were working on modest things, but we were building relationships. And this was a kind of special house for the folks that owned what was called the Big Bend Sentinel, so really investing ourselves in the culture and the people in Marfa. So friends like Wally Beshti, that we were here a couple of years ago at the Nasher, became collaborators. We created environments and even objects like that sculptural base that you see there. And then we began to finally made our way back to Los Angeles and began working on galleries, often adaptive reuse of kind of very banal buildings, but they were an opportunity for us to begin to think about the city through the lens of art. And LA, different than Dallas, but maybe somewhat the same. It's a big city. It's linked by large boulevards. So kind of finding destinations within that fabric and understanding the thresholds between this kind of speed of the car and the intimacy of the gallery and the kinds of spaces that you encounter between those were really important. We worked with the legacy press, it's called Lapis Press, that Sam Francis founded, and created a number of kind of cultural outposts like this bookstore Arcana, maybe some of you guys know, in LA. So I think we're very much invested in the culture of the arts and architecture in all the projects that we work on. And so as we have evolved our practice, working on maybe more refined exhibition environments, we're always looking at a way to find a conversation with the context in which we're working. So this is a gallery in LA, Maison d'Art. This is our most recent gallery it's called Roberts Projects. And I think what's been really exciting for us is many architects today working on adaptive reuse projects, finding the sort of idiosyncrasies of these buildings and amplifying them through light and through structure to create memorable environments for art. We also work on a lot of curatorial projects. This is with LACMA. It was for an exhibition for Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. So really an art historical project, but we also like to work with living artists. So this is longtime collaborators of ours is Jim Welling. We create a lot of his exhibition environments, so really looking at the relationship between the content of the work and the environment that one views the work. Takeshi Murakami, this is a project, it was a long-term collaboration that started at MoCA in the early 2000s and was part of a kit of parts for the Kakakiki merchandise room. And then we've also had the chance to curate shows ourselves. This is for a gallery in Los Angeles, where we were looking at the role of architecture in the transitions from modernism to postmodernism, where architecture was a theme for artists, and playing with the environment as both an exhibition environment, but also a participatory one, where art, furniture, and events like some pool were all part of this kind of thematic during the run of the show. So I think the next kind of chapter in terms of introducing part of our practice is really about collaboration, about curation, about teaching. And I think for Mark and I, we really see part of our responsibility as architects is about building a platform for conversation. We of course want to build buildings, but we also really want to engage our colleagues. We want to find shared experiences, shared ideas, to think about how to advance the field. So our role as the artistic directors of the Chicago Architecture Biennial was really, that was why we did it. We had no idea how much work it would be, but it was incredibly invigorating. I think we had maybe 130 architects from around the world, and I just will show you a few examples. This was what we called the Vertical City. It was in the Chicago Cultural Center that used to be the main public library. So incredible historic rooms. Here we were re-looking at an important competition, the Chicago Tribune Tower. This white tower in the middle there was a design by Adolf Loos that we rebuilt. But we wanted to put forward a prompt that would allow us to see what was happening in the discipline. So in these 16 towers, we're seeing people studying materials, structure, looking at how towers can kind of think of structural systems that allow for a much more flexible idea of an envelope in a tall building, and also how maybe a tower might begin to involve many different architects, so cores and shafts. This is Tatiana Bilbao's tower, but really looking at what folks were interested in and how we could begin to understand a conversation across the globe, really. And here in the GAR room, also in the Cultural Center, kind of a younger generation of architects, we asked them to think about the architectural interior, which we find incredibly important. And each one of them selected an important kind of iconic image in architectural history and developed a kind of interior landscape. This was from Marcel Duchamp, a Spanish architect, Super Studio. So they were really incredibly diverse, but in the way that we organized the room, we started to see commonalities and thematics that emerged across these practices. We looked at the city more generally. This is a project by Sana, where she was reimagining Brownsville in Chicago between IIT and the lake. Lots of other kind of architectural historians. Sylvia Levin reimagined a building by O.M. Ungers, looking at the German Architecture Museum, so the role of the model as part of a curatorial practice. Bauku, a Milan-based and Vienna-based practice, thinking about a kind of sacred space of the chapel as a platform for public space. There were environments for reading and salons for conversation, and of course books. And then also commissioning architects to think about really functional concerns of the Cultural Center that could become a platform for maybe new ways to use the building. This is Anna Jaworska. Bless, kind of reimagining a furniture landscape for one of the lounges. Camila Restepro, thinking about landscape through the surface of a curtain to reimagine some of these very difficult corridors in the building. And lastly, a kind of long-term collaboration between architects, Caruso St. and artist Thomas Dimond and Helen Binet, looking at that place between art and architecture through exhibitions like this. And from that, we right around that same time, we were asked to be part of a triennial in Lisbon. It's a every 3 years. And the exhibition content was for an exhibition about replicas. So it was an outdoor exhibition, and there were 3 firms, Johnston Marklee, Nuno Brandão Costa from Portugal, and Office Kirsten Gears, David Van Severen. And so we, after a lot of machinations, came up with an idea that we would each take a collection of 3 rooms from each of the practices and reimagine a new indoor-outdoor museum that was made from the assemblage of these rooms. And of course, given that it was a temporary building, it had a very tight budget, what was quite fascinating was how to reimagine these rooms that were built in very different kinds of materials as real projects in this very simple kit of parts, totally recyclable project. And we found that quite fascinating to kind of see our work through in this collage with our friends and colleagues, but also reimagining some of the kind of complexities and weird collisions when you need a structure like this because you don't have any structural in your vault. So I think the kind of open-endedness of projects like this is quite fascinating for us, and then all the works that were on the wall were literally replicas. They were Xeroxes that were or just wrapped in plastic. But I think what's interesting about these kinds of projects is they're ephemeral, and they also at the same time have a strong impact on the city. They host events, and they help us kind of build histories in these important places and in relationship to important institutions. So these, here's just an image of how it sits relative to the historic building. and Amanda Leverette's new building, and here's the pavilion right there along the river. And of course, the first version of this was in 2008 for the Ordos 100. That was a really important project in a way that set the stage for many of the collaborations that we've developed since then. It was organized by Ai Weiwei and Herzog and Demeron, who selected a group of architects, and we all developed a house that was going to be part of this pretty crazy master plan in Inner Mongolia in China. And eventually didn't happen because of a lot of changing political landscapes. But in any case, I think it's that kind of friendship and deep knowledge of our colleagues' work that was enduring from that project. So now, just to kind of get into the work, I think we've had a long-standing body of research in our academic work and in the office about art in the city and art in the landscape. So looking at examples like Hohenbroich in Germany or the Serpentine in London, Jinhua in China, Storm King, but also thinking about architecture in cities and the way that constellations of museums make a kind of really powerful fabric where it isn't the singular monument, but things like Marfa, we were talking about earlier, Dia in New York, the Menil, of course, the Berlin Biennial, which is a more ephemeral kind of order. But in any case, I think the idea of how these buildings make up the fabric of cities is really fascinating to us. So I'm going to start with a project that's it's under construction right now, but it is part of the Whitney Museum. And so there's the Whitney by Renzo, and that little red square is going to be the permanent home for what's called the Whitney Independent Study Program. So it's a very notable academic program for artists, visual artists, curators, and critical studies students. And what's kind of fascinating about the site is that it was the former studio of Roy Lichtenstein, and they bequested the building to the Whitney, and so we're making it the permanent home for the ISP, and then this addition that you see on the roof will be an artist studio, so we're adding program to that. So we're building on this incredible history of the Lichtensteins who renovated the building many times. And I think for us, what's been fascinating about this project, in a way, it's a very light touch. We almost think about our architectural interventions as infrastructure. In a way, it's very, very simple, almost ephemeral environments for the studios, but it's somewhere between the kind of legacy of the studio and the house and a place for art production and critical studies. So the ground floor, we transformed Roy's studio into the individual artist studios. Upstairs was their more domestic space, and we've subtly transformed the rooms and the structure to allow for the study and the kind of, they don't live here, but the more informal kind of debate spaces. So our intervention is architectural, but it's also at the scale of furniture. And I see that project in kind of a lineage of the next following projects. This is the Green Line Art Center. It's a kind of long-standing project. We've been working with the artist Theaster Gates and the University of Chicago. And so there was an initial competition, first site in the arts block, that Theaster has been transforming, really the kind of quintessential art urbanism project. And the Green Line Art Center is intended to be a home for many itinerant arts organizations about film and dance in Chicago. So it didn't have sort of one client, but many. And so here's the block. It's Green Line Art Center because that rail line is the Green Line. And so Theaster has been working on some of the buildings already, and that red square was the initial site for the project. And like the sort of art urbanism studies that I was showing you, Theaster has been thinking about the city that way for many years, buying buildings, building some new buildings, and really investing in the, reinvigorating the sort of emptying out of the south side of Chicago through architecture and art and programming. And so the original site for the project had a historic facade, which you'll see some images of. And our project was really to kind of drop in a very kind of inexpensive, almost kit of parts, warehouse type building that was modular, so it was quite adaptable, and that it could work within the kind of language of the existing surrounding buildings and in a way be quite modest, but have the volume and the sort of structural potential to accommodate a black box theater and things like that. So it sits right on that rail line, and it somehow hybridizes the type of that single family house, that simple roof, with the factory. And I think that kind of ambiguity of type is something that you'll see in a lot of our work. Inside, the simple bays allow for these kind of rehearsal spaces, the winter gardens, so they do a lot of climatic work in the in-between, and then a black box theater and a film theater, which was flexible so that you could open it and have large community events. So here is that historic facade, and I think the radical thing that Theaster has been working on in this community is not, the approach to architecture is about making things more open, more transparent, bringing more folks in as opposed to putting up barriers. So it's been a really interesting long-term discussion about how to think about urbanism and social practice as part of the project. So here's just some interior views where the kind of adjacencies of things are what makes this almost interior urbanism in the way that the theater, the rehearsal space, the black box can all be part of one environment or separated out. And I think for us, when we think about these cultural projects, and this is this is both really a community center, an art space, a performance space, maybe a space folks might need to spend the day in if they don't have they maybe have a lot of family in their house. So it's really like a living room in the city, and the hierarchy of how you enter, where you enter, that porosity to the city is how we think about all of our cultural projects, but in particular here, the front and back had a real reciprocity so that it was welcoming to all folks, and it, in a way, was really a host for events that happened outside of the walls as much as inside. And I think as the project has evolved, it's no longer going to be at this site, but we also were thinking a lot about how to create a platform for events that may not need buildings to frame them. So there's a lot of theater production that happens in Chicago, so thinking about outdoor stages for wood shops, or also musical concerts or dances that could be kind of a repetition of this simple structure, but without creating a fully interior and climatized space. The UCLA Graduate Art Studios is part of the UCLA campus, but it's been, since its founding in the mid-'80s, has been in an off-site place in Culver City. For those of you who know LA, it's maybe about 10 miles or so from the Westwood campus. And when we were initially commissioned, this is the site. It's a kind of beautiful old bow truss building with a sort of number of appendages that were, through our study, were kind of no longer really functional. And so we, of course, always started by understanding the fabric. It's a place, the architects in the room would know the work of Errico and Moss, so it's really evolved over, even in the course of our original study to when we built the building. Some of these buildings were not originally there, but it's a very spectacular, highly articulated kind of fabric of buildings, all built by one developer. But the history of the campus, or the tract, as it's called, of these kind of buildings, tilt-up, very kind of generic warehouse buildings. And so our project is the only institutional building in this neighborhood, wanted to find a kind of intermediate space between the low-lying kind of generic background buildings and the scale of some of these more signature buildings around us. So that it's tilt-up concrete construction. The perimeter walls were erected in 3 days. So they were cast in place, cured, and then erected in 3 days. So speed was really a challenge. But I think what's just important to say about the project is, while it is an institution in an urban setting, what was important is that these kind of open spaces are the studio labs where kids are making work. So the historic building was renovated for their studios, and these great yards, loading docks, and things like that are open to the city. You always enter through a garden. So these are covered but unconditioned spaces. We had an incredible donor, that Margot Levin, who was a great philanthropist and gallerist in LA, and she was also a great gardener, and we always thought about the garden as being a key part of how the kids want to spend time as part of their life in this building, and Margot really supported that. The kitchen is right next door, so this is a classroom, it's a place to eat, it's a place to hang out, it's a place to crit, and it's not conditioned. So we were able to add like 30% to the building without conditioning it, so operationally that was really efficient. So these are these double height yards that are, it's 6 different disciplines of work, so it's very flexible. It's over 30 feet to the top of the wall, so it's very large in scale. and allows for them to work in very different mediums. And very inexpensive building, so we had to search for where to find the architecture, and this is literally, it was just baked into the mold of the tilt-up walls. And then there's special moments like these where the kind of crescent becomes a circle at the corner, and then thinking about the detail, how to terminate the roof by that simple cornice that animates the building through light and shadow. And really over the course of the day, it's very cinematic. Light is changing on the facade all the time. So it's a very heavy and massive building, but it is also quite light in the way that light falls on it and in the volume. So this is the interior studios and the warehouse that we renovated. So the idea was that this was how it might open, but it was very simple wood frame construction, so it could change over time. Each artist has her own studio, and it's unified. There's no ceilings on these spaces, so there's really a sense of community in the way that you feel the sort of vibe of your 40 other cohorts. And then twice a year, these studios become exhibition spaces, so that kind of adaptability is really baked into all of the spaces in the building, and the students have agency really over every inch of the building. This is a project at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and it's really right just west of downtown Chicago, and it is notable for the work of Walter Nesch, who was an SOM leader at SOM in the 60s. So originally it was a very brutalist campus, these concrete buildings with elevated walkways. It was somehow spectacular, but not very human. But those buildings exist today, and so that became a bit of a point of departure for us. And this project was bringing together a number of the arts programs on campus, and it sits on a site on the north edge, northeast corner of the site of the campus, right along the freeway. So for us, there's a performing arts hall and a theater, and so we thought of these two blocks that become, in a way, a kind of backdrop to the city of Chicago to the east. And the idea was that it was phased, and it had a kind of very flexible podium that would be the kind of new student center, a space that didn't exist on campus today. So this is the concert hall, kind of hits the ground in a very low-lying and generous way. The building is a very simple curtain wall building it was a proposed, just a perforated scalloped cladding so that it was diaphanous, and while it felt sort of massive and primitive in its form, it changed over the course of the day. This winter garden did a lot of good work for us in terms of environmental performance. It could open up during swing season so we could lessen the load capacity for cooling and heating. And then towards the city, it was a much more vertical building. This is the theater, so loading happened below. And a little bit like the Wiley, the building could open up and you would have a view back to the city. So in the way that these chimneys, the kind of double skins, formed a kind of heat chimney to allow warm air to evacuate out of the top. This is just a little video that gives you an idea of how that transformation happens through the course of the day. So the inner kind of box becomes much more dominant, and seeing people pass through and such in the evening. Another campus, a little closer to home, campus project. We were finalists for this new arts building it's called VADA, so Visual and Dramatic Arts at Rice University. And this site is kind of at the edge of campus. For those of you that know the Moody Center, it's right next to the Moody Center, so a kind of new part of the campus that's being developed. And what was fascinating for us was that all of the arts programs at Rice were being brought together for the very first time, and eventually there was plans for a graduate arts program. So we thought about this building really as a kind of arts palace, a factory for art, and the idea, it sits on the edge of campus. It also sits at a new entry to the campus, so it had a kind of gateway-like presence on the facade, but it needed to address a residential neighborhood, the Moody, so it's really a building in the round, and we played around with the language of, obviously the tradition at Rice is Texas brick, and so each facade, it's almost like a kind of woven tapestry of different techniques for working with the brick that was responsive to the surrounding neighborhood. And so here's the Moody on the left, and I think what is always fascinating for us in all of our projects, and in particular, and like academic campuses is thinking as much about the building itself as the space between buildings. How do you really activate those spaces and make them intimate and useful? So here is that kind of new alley. One of the things that's been a real detriment about Moody so far is that dark brick is so hot that you really can't, it's like 120 degrees there. So we envisioned this new alley that would be where students could make work, and it became a kind of shady corridor from something that was almost uninhabitable before. And then inside the building, it was really like a factory, very, very kind of low budget project, but the idea of having these kind of extended visual views into all the different departments' work was part of creating this new community that was about erasing borders between disciplines and thinking about film and architecture and painting as part of a really dynamic interplay. And I think also an idea that is, germane to a lot of our work is about adaptability, thinking about how to make a building that can change in time. So this very simple framework could allow for that to happen. There's a sort of, industrial quality to the building. And lastly, this project was a finalist for a competition. So for the students out there, it's really important to do this work. You don't always win, but you learn a lot along the way. So this is for a university campus, a small private university that's sort of founded on the interplay of art and technology, and it's in Buenos Aires. It's Ditella University, so it's literally just this courtyard. And so there was a number of existing buildings, and then this building was relatively new, and so our site was right here. So a new classroom building, but what was interesting about it was that it's a rapidly growing school, and so it was the brief. We needed to provide classrooms and such, but we also needed to imagine that the top 2 floors even might be rented out to as office space. So it was really kind of radical about building as infrastructure, as flexible as it could possibly be, while also being really responsive to climatic concerns and the idea that this is a campus, this is not an office park. So the kind of porosity of the building and the way that it addresses the edges of the courtyard and the existing buildings was really an area of focus for us. So, you'll see in the museum projects coming, but the integration of architecture and landscape is just essential in all of our work. And so here we were thinking about creating those buffer zones between the existing buildings and our building and how the role of the garden could be that connective tissue. Looking back at the classrooms, and that extended porch is also a kind of garden that would be a flexible space that would allow for different kinds of reciprocity across disciplines. Faces a park to the north, so it had, like many of our projects, had very diverse edges, and that's always kind of fascinating to us. So now I'm going to move on to the kind of final chapter, which is the museum projects, and they're pretty diverse in typology, in location, and I think that is incredibly important to us, that we do get to work with institutions like the Menil, but we're also working with very sort of boots on the ground, very collaborative, emergent, experimental institutions as well. And this was a new organization called Philadelphia Contemporary, and the site was between Drexel University in Philly and Penn, and it bordered a kind of historically really challenged network of largely African-American neighborhoods. And so it was a project that involved a lot of participation, a lot of meetings, a lot of walking. It was very much about engagement as much as it was about design. So here are the academic buildings that define Drexel and Penn. And then these are some of the most really incredible but decaying buildings that are part of Mantua and Powelton, but really highly dignified buildings at the same time. And so the idea for this museum, it's a museum, it's really a platform for art, as our director envisioned it, was that the experience with art started out in the city. And so we thought about it really as a kind of scaffolding. And so these platforms had different, these pavilions that were envisioned to be created together with artists that could even be designed and activated before the building was finished and out in the city, and then would come to the building. So there was a camera obscura, a DJ booth, a garden, But all the senses would be activated by artists before you even, or if you didn't even enter the building. So I think that kind of that radical porosity is something so many museums talk about today, but here was really taken to an extreme. And so we developed a kind of series of what we call tables, which are these platforms, this scaffolding to support these elements, which was integral to the frame, the structural frame of the building. So it was a steel building, and then on the inside it was a very simple concrete table. So really almost like a parking garage in a way. Very, very low budget, very direct, very adaptable. So here's some of those views where you get a sense of that structure. Really incredible program, something called a harbor space, for example, which was, they had an idea about hosting entrepreneurial, like there was a radio station that was going to host, be able to have some space in the museum for a period of time, or a bike repair shop. So it was really a really fascinating process. In the end, this site was not realized for various financial reasons, but I think it was incredibly eye-opening for us to see how close we could get to the folks that use a building like this and learn from them. This is, for example, the education, the classrooms that were really the front facade of the building. So learning spaces are more and more important in museums, and so this was really, and that's the camera obscura, so seeing kids learning and engaging with the city was really their primary goal. Then on the third floor, there was a kind of more typical black box theater and a top-lit gallery. So it really had kind of every typology of art space, from very low to kind of more traditional. And we've also been involved in kind of master plan studies, and interestingly enough, this is for MoCA in Los Angeles. So finished by Isesaki in the mid-'80s. And here, this is on Grand Avenue in Los Angeles, and so the street has changed quite a lot since Isesaki finished the building, with Mineo and Gehry, Himmelblau, and I guess most recently, Diller Scofidio. And in a way, all these things happen around the museum, but it somehow hadn't evolved. It has an incredible collection, but somehow its architecture couldn't really find that connection with the life of the city over time as it was built up around. So you would see more and more signage and other ways to try to remind people that MoCA is there. So we went back and looked, of course, at these beautiful De Chirico-esque drawings of Isesaki, of this sort of primitive landscape of very simple forms, and then looked at it in the context of how the Bunker Hill development has come to be realized. And there were so many changes that the way in which Isesaki envisioned it being integral to the fabric of those towers never really happened, because the public realm of that area was not realized. And so we began, really our brief to start was to say, how can we reimagine the public realm? When the Broad was built, it was just a kind of spectacle. There was people lining up, and the MoCA just felt more and more invisible. So we began by identifying certain kind of almost like acupuncture, starting to remove things that became barriers, like this canopy and the ticketing box, which kind of blocked your entry in. We thought about framing the courtyard, the main entry plaza, by adding a wall, so strengthening the connection to the city by creating more definition, enlarging porches that link you down into the museum, because the entry to MoCA is below ground, which is always challenging. And as part of that study, we were also then said, okay, well, if we're really imagining expanding the public realm of MoCA, what would it mean to also expand the galleries? So we looked carefully at the history of Isesaki's work at this time and imagined this kind of chamfered skylight, which was part of a body of work he was doing in this period. And I think what we found kind of fascinating was, by further framing the edges by adding more mass, that void, the courtyard, became even more significant as an urban space in the city. So there's been a lot of, this is a good image of that, in the way that the void becomes more framed. Many director changes and evolution, but there's an incredible team there at MoCA today, and we're starting to talk to them again about how to begin to realize this project. In Chicago, back in Chicago, we've had a long-term relationship with the MCA. This is a building that was built by Joseph Paul Kleihuis, finished in the mid-'90s, and it's I think what defines most museums in Chicago is they're museums and parks. But the MCA, while it does sit in a park, it's an incredibly tight site. It's within a neighborhood of towers. And so it has really a lot of challenges. I don't know if any of you guys have been there, but Kleihues was working on the Hamburger Bahnhof at that time in Berlin. He really had this idea of the museum as a station, as a place of passage. And so the idea of going up these stairs, reaching the podium in the museum, and then passing back out into the park was really the idea. But, you know, certain things to do with the scale, just simply the height of those stairs is almost impenetrable. It's very hard to get up those stairs, especially in cold Chicago winters. So our charge was to think about a master plan and then a phase 1 renovation. So I think one of the ways we always start our projects, especially in museum projects, is thinking about flow and circulation. So this was before dead ends, lack of connectivity, and this was after. So reimagining where the restaurant was, adjacent to the theater, adding new stairs that kind of opened up a dead end that links you back up to the museum. So it really has connectivity across the building and plan and section, and it's been, even with the phase 1 completion, been a really incredible transformation. So before, due to budget cuts and things, only one of the stairs was finished, so despite being a symmetrical building, it's asymmetrical in the way that it flows, so proposing to add another stair. So really what we did, all within the envelope of the building, was we added about 17,000 square feet of public space, which you can see here. We added a new floor in the back of the building for education. This is restaurants, a commons, and so, you know, as we all know, the role of the museum, the way folks, their expectations are for art spaces has changed. And I think that was a really incredible mission on the part of Madeline, the director, to really invest this much real estate in public space. So here is that new education floor underneath the commons, and it all slips very precisely within the Kleihues grid, so there's no perception of that on the facade of the building. This space is for long-term artist installations. This is by Pedro Niwana. And then this is the new stair that we added, and it's become both a space, of course, of circulation. It brings daylight into the bottom of the building, but it's also, in its scale, it of course relates to the Kleihues stair, but it also, in its proportion, has become a platform for artists. So we always try to think about how one move can solve many things and become an opportunity for artist activation. So here's what we call the street. So now this is no longer a dead end. It links from east to west. There's that stair, the cafe. I think another notable part of this project is for the ground floor restaurant. And the interiors of this, we worked with the artist Chris O'Feely. So Chris worked with us on the color palette and, of course, did some site-specific works. But this is the new theater entry, and so it's a mix of programs and functions that are always changing throughout the day. And so this space is highly active from something that was sort of dark and inaccessible before. Here's Chris's mural that you see on the wall, and then drawings on these windows. So it's a really animated space, and the way in which architecture and interiors come together with art is, I think, quite intertwined and successful. And so here's the kind of vision, eventually, of our master plan, the expansion, which would reimagine the park to the east, to the river. The idea of a winter garden being the kind of new linking space to that park. And then if this would be the future west facade, where the base is finally realized as a more open and transparent public realm. And then on the east side, once again, always being quite responsive to the kind of logic of Kleihues as a kind of context, but thinking about it in a softer, more ephemeral way with this kind of slightly oil-canned aluminum. So always finding that conversation between history and the contemporary. This is probably our newest project, which is in Basel, Switzerland, and it's a collaboration between our team and the Basel-based firm Chris Gantenbein, who are really the base building architects. And so the Hauptbau is, one of the most important museums in the world, built in 1936. And so our role in collaborating with Chris Gantenbein is to really think about all the public realm of the museum and how to reimagine this important building with an art-first lens. So the first things that you'll encounter are things like this, an art terrace, where the flow of the restaurant and art engagement will be the first thing that you pass through, as well as through gardens. So these kind of subtle ways in which maybe more abstract or blank walls have new windows, new points of access. The courtyard becomes activated through art. The new ticketing is reactivated with new connections to a proposed sculpture garden. The art lab, which is a kind of a magical courtyard. The smaller courtyard in the back of the building will be a place for experimental art installations. It's immediately adjacent to the education spaces and the theater, so kind of collapsing different kinds of audiences from events like this with classroom spaces. And then thinking about those moments when you arrive at the top of a stair, what is that space like before you enter into a gallery, and thinking about how to activate those, thinking about contemporary needs. Of course, we'll be restoring the galleries, really kind of rebuilding the building, but then looking at things like years ago, the rooftop terrace was closed off. So thinking within the framework of the building, how to make these surgical edits that activate and bring more encounters with artists and their audiences across the building. And then we uncovered these kind of magical spaces adjacent to the building that we envision as garden spaces. And so thinking about, again, the role of nature and art as being something that's so important to kind of wellness and the kind of social and diverse environments we expect to encounter art today. And so, of course, things like bookshops and cafes are also a really important part of that. This is a listed building, so a really incredibly rigorous process that we're about to begin. But I think the idea of taking a historic building like this and stitching it more deeply into the fabric of the city is what we really love to do. And then lastly, I'm ending with the Menil Drawing Institute. So this is the campus of the Menil in Houston. It's about a 30-acre campus. Of course, we all know this building of Renzo's that was finished in 1987. We worked so closely with Dominique on this project. Wonderful stories about their collaboration. And I think there's some really important people at the Menil who have been carrying forward that legacy about the importance of architecture and the kind of humility of this place as a place for community to come together and engage with art in a really unaffected way. So this is the campus when we were confronted with the competition. It was a competition that we were a finalist for. So this is Renzo, this is Cy and Renzo, this is the Rothko Chapel that was just renovated by ARO. So 30 acres, but this building was taking up quite a lot of that space. And so I think it's a unique art campus in America in that it is a dispersed museum. The main building is really the anchor, but these other kind of magical buildings, some are adaptive reuse, like the Flavin building, the Byzantine Chapel by I'm sorry, I'm spacing on Dominique's son, Philip Johnson, Rothko Chapel, and then Cy Twombly. So I think what you'll see here is that it's both those museums, it's the pre-war bungalows that are part of that fabric, many of which the Menil family bought and are part of the foundation today. And so before we began the project, David Chipperfield did a master plan. And this was the original campus, and the idea was that the apartment building would go away, and this would be redeveloped along Richmond Avenue as a mixed-use development. The apartment building was a really large source of revenue for the foundation. And so the first building that was part of that plan was the Drawing Institute, which is that purple block. It's really about in the geographic center of the campus, and it was going to signal the future programmatic needs. And so it was within the site of the apartment building, and Dominique had planted these trees in part of the parking zone. So our first move was to kind of create rooms around these existing trees, so create courtyards around the trees, and then the building just slipped in around those trees. So it's somewhere between the scale of a house and an institutional building. So here's the campus, a kind of before and after. This is what's called kind of the necklace that wraps around the big green, around the Menil Collection building. So we're nestled right up against that. We open up this space that used to be the Energy House, so you get to finally see the south elevation of the Twombly Pavilion, and then we created a new Energy House. We worked with our dear friends at Michael van Valkenburg, who I know has been an important landscape architect here in Dallas. And Michael worked a bit on the master plan and was integral to the landscape of the project. So it's really, we added this new road, so it's really stitched into the future of the campus through infrastructure below ground and above ground with new roads. This is the new Walter D. Maria relocated drawings in the ground there on the east side of the building. You're looking towards St. Thomas to the east. And so from the south, this is a park that Michael and his team have begun to think about transforming, but to the south, it's really like a porch to this large, simple park. It almost, in a way, doesn't signal how you enter the building. It's just kind of a piece in the landscape. When you come around from the north, this is the west courtyard. So this is, we worked with the structural engineer Guy Nordenson, so this is quite a complex corner where this 60-foot span happens with a very thin 8-foot rib steel structure. So when you come from the Menil Collection, you're welcomed a little bit like a catcher's mitt into this open courtyard. These oak trees are sitting within a field of kind of leftover marble from a Vermont quarry. So this is a really active courtyard space. It's folks are playing on those stones. So it's really a room in the campus. And for us, that was so important as a transition from the 30-acre campus and the bright sun as a threshold before entering in to the Drawing Institute. So it's really a porch, it's a place of passage. Some folks just pass by this building every day and maybe never enter, but it has a kind of generosity about it that's quite welcoming. So here we're looking directly on axis from west looking east, and now we've come into the building and looking back out. So despite having very significant environmental controls, light, daylight, side light, which is much more like domestic light, and views of the landscape are always present. So there's a kind of tension there between the content of the building and the way it relates to its site. The living room is the central area. It was a piece of the program that we sort of invented in the competition where we eliminated a lot of dead-end corridors and brought everybody in through this space. So it's a place for meeting. It's become another kind of gallery for wall drawings that don't have as strict of lighting requirements, and a social space for lectures and things like that. But you can see the third courtyard is on the left there, which is the scholar courtyard. And here we're looking on the south side of the living room is the gallery. So lower light levels in that space. It's calibrated just for works on paper in proportion and atmosphere. This is one of the, after Jasper Johns, which was the first show, this is the show of Ronnie Horn. And then back out in the living room on the north side of the building is the staff, administration, the Scholar Study Center, and the conservation laboratory. So here, the north light fills these spaces. It has much less environmental requirements in this particular area. Michael selected a kind of small multi-trunk magnolia, so the light and shadow in this space is really dynamic and delicate and more almost residential in feeling. The heart of the building is the Scholar Study Room. This is where conservators, scholars, students come to look at drawings in different modes of daylight. And then immediately adjacent to that is the Scholar Study Center, and I think one of the unique parts of this building, because it is in the United States the only building dedicated to works on paper. So we had the privilege of looking at best practices from around the world, and one of the main things was having the conservation lab and the study room immediately adjacent, because scholars are moving between those two spaces all the time. Back now at the living room, and these sort of ancillary spaces that are giving you a place of contemplation to look back and orient you to the campus. Of course, this ottoman is inspired by the Charles James piece that Dominique and Charles James developed for her house, that Renzo developed for the Menil collection, and is reimagined here again with the incredible fabricator and designer Jeff Jameson, who builds all the Judd furniture. So here's more of these tables that we designed and created with Jeff. So sometimes this room is really a library. or an immersive wall drawing installation. This was one of the first wall drawings that the Menil did, and it's continued to expand and experiment. So this is the East Courtyard, a little bit more domestic, flowering plants. This is a heritage tree. Now we're moving kind of to the south along West Main. You get a sense of how the sculpted roofs kind of shape light and shadow. It's been an active social space for videos and yoga classes. It's kind of amazing how this space has really blossomed in the culture of Houston. This is a kind of special piece. It was one of the last works by Ellsworth Kelly, that is in the tradition of the donor pieces that kind of commemorate the support of the donors for each building at the Menil. This is called the Menil Curve. So it sits just with a slightly wider and more reflective finish in front of our building. It gives you a sense of that finally we can see the south side of the beautiful Twombly Pavilion. Just some kind of fun shots. This building is kind of photographed a lot, and it's just fun to see how people see it through different times of day. It's of course always changing, and we love to see those kinds of activations. And just in closing, I think what we strive for in all of our work is this kind of in-betweenness. We're inspired very much by Aldo and Henny van Eyck, that they talked about this condition of architecture as a twilight condition between inside and outside, building and landscape, between the museum and the house. And we find those were the kinds of inspirations for the Drawing Institute and things that we think about in our work. So thank you so much.